uprising that he was? What was he talking about? I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's periodic intensifications of strife that frequently have to do with the Temple Mount, which is like the nexus point of issues. Mazin, you are using Rena's computer. Can you hear us? We cannot hear you. Okay, I will answer that question. I have to work on many things at once.
Are we good?
Not quite. Mazin is here on another laptop, but that laptop doesn't seem to have its microphone enabled or its webcam enabled. Yeah, thank you for bearing with this. I guess it was an inevitable that one of these classes would be a technical chaos like this. All right. Yeah. Well. So, I'm gonna wait for an email from Mazin. Yeah. So that's a great question, and I don't understand much of the details of it, but basically the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is like the one of the most tense areas, and it's highly segregated. So for the most part, only Muslims can enter, but most Palestinians can't get to the Temple Mount because the Temple Mount is on the other side of the separation barrier. So it's like kind of like no one is allowed there. Like Israelis aren't really allowed up there, except in really, really controlled circumstances. And Israeli Arabs, Israeli Muslims can go there. And the Temple Mount itself is controlled by a pan-Arab, but like mostly Jordanian organization called the Waqf, that has been, very, very domineering in its control. Because it's just like it's like the most sacred place for all the Abrahamic faiths, and also it's this like just like incredibly tense political thing. So the current event that happened was, and I'm not sure the causality of it, but I think there was a stabbing or a shooting in a settlement, and Netanyahu, who's the prime minister of Israel, responded by putting security equipment like scanners and things above, to the entrance, all of the entrances of the Temple Mount, and banned any Muslim men under the age of 50 from going there, which is a common ban that they do from time to time because terrorists are always younger than 50. So they'll let the older religious looking men in, but so that's the current state of affairs. But what it resonates with is the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which is the second Intifada that started in 2002, maybe it was 2003. And it's called the Al-Aqsa Intifada because it was triggered by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon going on a tour of the Temple Mount with 1,000 armed troops. And he says like, oh, this is Israel, I should just be able to go right. But he like went into this holy site with an army, like literally with an army. And that triggered a armed rebellion from various Palestinian groups, and it turned very bloody. And I don't know if I have my dates right. It might have concluded in 2003, but it was in the early 2000s. And it lasted. The second Intifada was much bloodier than the first. Intifada is Arabic for shaking off. It concluded with the construction of the separation barrier, the big wall. Yeah. Mazin is back.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay.
I don't know what kind of business we are in, but this is. So,
Welcome back.
answer any questions, or do you want me to do a little bit on the presentation?
Yeah.
Basically, more on.
I would like
aspects.
to. I don't know. We don't necessarily need to go back to your slides if you think that that is going to cause too many problems, and you did most of them.
Yeah,
You know,
maybe that's.
maybe one thing you could do is could you email me the slides and then I can share them with the group and you can keep talking without the screen share on?
Okay, sounds good.
That could be a potential solution. But I'm quite curious to hear a little bit more about the genotoxicity study that you did, and you that was sort of where you got cut off. That paper is particularly striking to me as an intersection of biological research and resistance and activism. And I'd love to hear a little bit more details about how that study worked and what you did, and also what you think its wider implications are.
Yeah. So, as I said, knowledge sometimes is powerful. It's important to do things a meticulous way. We were also talking about in terms of, like, of course, as a Palestinian, as I was born here, I was subjected to problems, and you can say, well, that's the bias here in the presentation is a Palestinian native perspective. But I'm also a scientist. I never say anything or write anything or publish anything unless I can document and I can defend it, by using factual information. So in the case of genotoxicity, for example, Israel put its worst polluting industries in the West Bank, in the background, basically, of the Palestinian neighborhoods, Palestinian neighborhood. This is, again, not unusual in world history, that people who are privileged, they put the most polluting industries next to poor people. When I worked at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, there were very polluting industries put in the parts of Chattanooga where the inner city is, basically, because the rich suburbs, I don't want them in their background, if you want, or backyards or whatever. So that's, again, understandable in some sense. So in terms of putting these toxic pollutants that are dumped on the local people, they don't care about the health of the local people. So what am I going to do as a Palestinian? I want to see the effect of this on the human health. So with the case-controlled studies, our controls were basically Palestinians from the Bethlehem region, because in Bethlehem here, to whatever cosmic intervention there is, we don't have Israeli industrial settlements around Bethlehem. We have only residential settlements. So by having the case control being Palestinians here versus Palestinians who are exposed in the area of Burkan and Safit, we saw significant, statistically significant things that study showed, and it was a double-blind study. So when it is an International Journal of Environmental Studies, it means other scientists reviewed the findings and find them convincing. So again, it's not biased studies, it's studies that are scientific. When we looked at decline in vertebrate biodiversity in Bethlehem, or in that diet of that eagle owl, these are all case-controlled, well-documented studies that are easily defended in the scientific literature. The ramifications, of course, is something else. And I'm trying to get the Palestinian Authority to use some of our data sample to go after Israel in international courts. I have no takers. They are not interested in this, partly because the Palestinian Authority basically acts as a Vichy government in protecting the security of the occupiers, not really interested. He spends 43% of its budget in welfare. Most of it is for the Israeli security, not for the Palestinian security. So that's where we are, and we have huge challenges. In my humble opinion, the challenges that we face are part of global challenges on the environment, where people, I think part of the reason we have such conflicts, as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is now an opinion, this is not a scientific observation at this point. Part of the reason why I think we have conflicts around the world and historically is money, basically. You have to follow the money, where the money is coming from. The elite rich people, whether elite rich Palestinians or elite rich Israelis or elite rich Americans, they make lots of money from these conflicts. And it has nothing to do with they try to pitch it to us basically as conflicts between people and religions and all of this stuff, but that's only to hide the reality. I think the reason you have sectarian conflicts in Iraq and Syria and all of this stuff is precisely the same reason. It's not that they are sectarian conflicts. It's that they are conflicts started for money and power and influence of rich elites, the 1%. And then they try to use the religious and other conflicts to try and get the emotions high and get people involved in them more to hide the reality of who's profiting from these wars. This is my philosophy about wars and conflicts, if you want. There is some evidence for that, but again, I didn't do scientific studies on that aspect. We can talk about that if you guys want.
Yeah, well, just to stay on the genotoxicity study for just a little bit to clarify a detail. So you went to this area outside of Hebron that has a lot of computer recycling, and you got DNA samples, and then you were inspecting chromosomes. Like what was the thing that you were measuring? What is a chromosomal aberration?
Yeah, so there's two variables that we were measuring. DNA damage, which is basically broken DNA. And breaks in DNA happen normally when we are subjected to mutagens or carcinogens. These breaks in DNA can get repaired, or they don't get repaired, can arrest the cell cycle, or they don't get repaired, or they happen to be next to cancer-causing genes which cause cancer. The incidence of DNA breaks that we observe in single cells as we run them on gels, we can measure the DNA breaks, and we saw significantly increased DNA breaks. So that's one variable. The other variable we study is chromosome breaks, and that's by looking at the chromosomes themselves. So the DNA is, of course, inside the chromosomes. So we look at unrepaired chromosome breaks in the second, in the division of the cells, basically, as they go through cell cycle and metaphase and anaphase. And we saw significant increase like dicentric chromosomes, chromosome rings, chromosome breaks, chromatid breaks. We saw increased incidence of those kinds of chromosome defects in cells of the subjects who are exposed to the in the area, both in that electronic recycling area and also in the area that's next to the Israeli industrial settlement. Again, compared to control site, which had very few of those kinds of breaks. This is in brief what these two studies on genotoxicity showed, is compared to control sites, there's more chromosome damage, more DNA damage and chromosome damage.
Cool. So I have another question. So I'm gonna try to do a screen share on my end, which may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, I'll just ask the question in person. But I was going through some old footage that I took when I was with you last winter. And there's an interview with Elias. And I wanna share something he said and see if I can get your input on it. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm in Premiere. Okay, I'll turn up my volume. So here's Elias.
Kind of resistance. Why? Because you put, like, just mention the Palestinian territory or West Bank or occupied Palestine, this word in your topics or publication, it's like really kind of resistant, because you are like, okay, I'm telling the universe, we are still Palestinian, we are here, we are not like vanish or something. But just look, and when we first published our first paper about butterfly, they rejected. Why? Because we put Palestine. It's sometimes difficult.
Okay, so that was that clip. Yeah, so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish by publishing this stuff, and how it ties into resistance as a general concept.
Yeah, I mean, the last paper we submitted for publication is on a kind of leishmania, which is a disease that is transmitted by a kind of fly. And when we sent the paper, it got accepted after peer reviewed, got published in the Journal of Vector Ecology, International Journal of Vector Ecology, and the editor just emailed us, said that he received this letter from a guy in New York who happens to be Israeli, I guess, now living in New York, working in the health field with mosquitoes in New York. And he had this very lengthy letter titled that, these guys, I'm not a co-author on that paper, there are other people from the museum. But anyway, he says that we are trying to erase Israel off of the existence by using the word Palestine to describe the area as a state of Palestine. So why are we using this term, and why aren't we mentioning Israel? Well, I mean, our work is Palestine, and geographically this area is Palestine. Israel is a political entity. I don't want to get into the politics of, but I wanted to explain to you how Israel was created on top of Palestine, because that's the reality. The geographic name of this country is Palestine. The political reality here is the state of Israel. No matter how one feels about the state of Israel, I feel about it, of course, as an apartheid racist state. But that's my own feeling, and you can agree or disagree, I don't care. But the point is, in terms of the geography, it's still Palestine. And in fact, the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, when they have their fauna and flora studied, they published them in a series of books called Fauna Palestina and Flora Palestina. These are Israeli highest body of scientists calling their volumes Fauna Palestina and Flora Palestina. Why? Because geography is the geographic area is Palestine. The political reality is Israel, and I'm fine with that. I don't have an issue. We can discuss the legitimacy of the state of Israel if people want to discuss. But as far as the science, it's still Palestine.
So the mission of the museum is to explore or to document the biodiversity of the region, and then get Palestinian people involved in perceiving their land in a more ecologically minded way. Is that a fair assessment of what you're trying to accomplish?
I was cutting, so I didn't quite get all the
glitches. Yeah, well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is this theme about land and like the developing a relationship with land, and that like doing these ecological studies and gathering this kind of data produces a kind of knowledge about geography and about biotic life that is fairly unique. And that's sort of that knowledge and that way of seeing the world is getting superimposed on this sectarian conflict. So I guess you've been talking about this the entire time, but I guess I'm asking you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between the ecology work that you're doing and the political situation.
I mean, that's another point, is you cannot separate things completely, of course, because when Israel was created, for example, in 1948, the first committee of scientists and geographers they created was a committee to rename all the localities, rename everything. All the villages that were destroyed, they created new names for those areas. It was a renaming society, if you want, of experts. And that's, again, that's not unusual in world history. All colonizers do this. I mean, when you think about who named Cape Town in South Africa or Johannesburg or those places, it's basically Dutch colonizers or British colonizers in South Africa. So the idea is to change everything. Now, as the native people, what's their job? Their job is, well, it's not their job. It's their common sense is that they keep the names and they say this was such and such place. So the maintenance of the terminology of the old ways and the old days and the old towns and villages is also common sense for the people, the local people try and do. So this is where I talked about two narratives. The narrative of somebody who wants to change the names and create new reality, people who want to maintain the reality as they lived it and as they experienced it throughout their lives and as their ancestors experienced it. Here, the museum role, of course, is to document this. Now, I document the change of names, for example. And, whether you call it Ashkelon, for example, or you call it Ascalon, you call it Lidda, or you call it Lud, or whatever, I mean, that's up to the person who's using those terms. But it's important to document these changes. It's important to document the history, because history of people is also part of history of nature. So I have a museum of natural history. To me, natural history is not just the history of animals and plants, it's also people, because people are part of nature, so you have to put the history of people. Without judgment. I mean, you don't have to make a judgment on whether it was good or bad. You just have to say, this is what happened.
So I can, there's a lot I'd love to talk about, but I'm wondering if there's anyone in the class who wants to chime in at this point.
Are they there?
They're here.
Nobody.
I'll chime in. I'm first of all, I'm noticing the artwork in your office behind you, or in the museum, the JR portraits of the Arab and Israeli people that were pasted up all over different parts of Israel, occupied Palestine, on the wall itself. I'm also noticing the Banksy stencil of I don't know if it was specific to the Palestine.
You have good.
It's a person throwing a Molotov cocktail, but instead of a Molotov cocktail, it's a flowers, right? Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I'm an artist. I'm seeing a lot of connections between art and science. And while over the course of these different talks that we've been having, the series of talks, and I see art as a tool for activism and as a tool for communication. And I'm also seeing science as a tool for communication and in this case, in your case, definitely activism. And you know, there's different means of taking action for whatever purpose in life you have, right? And so, and you can have violent action, non-violent action, protest. And I kind of see you as using your skill set and your tools as a scientist, and responding to historic and current injustices that you see. My question, I guess, and something that is interesting to me is, you have a museum, you know, and that word museum has different meanings for different people. Like, for example, in New York here, we have museums as these massive cultural institutions, and some are scientific, some are artistic, but the role of a museum is malleable. There's different types of roles that a museum takes on. And I hear you talk about how your museums, one of the roles of your museum is to document the objective facts of name changes or toxicology reports or whatever. But why did you, or I guess I'm just curious, how do you end up at the place of having a museum? Like, how do you end up at the place of, like, okay, well, this is going to be my life's work, is creating a museum. You know what I mean? And as opposed to a different name for an institution, or, you know, so I'm just curious about why a museum, you know?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I started actually as a biologist. I've always been interested in nature. From when I was 10 years old, I've been very interested in nature. Moved away from that to ethics and towards even human rights works. And I wrote a book called Nonviolent Resistance, and I practiced nonviolent resistance. And I'm glad I did all of that, because I think that actually connected me to humanity in ways that I've never thought possible if I stayed just basically interested in research per se, or you know, watching nature, writing about mammals, bats, whatever. So by participating in nonviolent resistance, one of the things that one sees is, okay, you do a demonstration, for example, that's nonviolent or that's popular resistance. You go to a checkpoint, try to cross a checkpoint. The way to succeed in these things is to have a massive number of people. And this is the bottleneck here. How do we get enough people to rise up and do things that are in their own best interest, right? They are Palestinians, Israelis, Americans, whoever. Many people, the biggest challenge we have is not those greedy, whatever, 1%, they call them, 99 versus 1%. It's actually more like 0.1% of the population that's very greedy. I'm not concerned about those. What concerns me is the pathetic people, the people who are not doing anything, not care. They just want to live their lives, pay off their student debts, whatever. They are not, and this apathy is what bothered me for many, many years. So, okay, here's where I made the connection. Myself, one way we can reach people is to start with children, because adults pretty much we have chains around our brains through culture, language, whatever, tribalism, nationalism, society keep us with, so our brains kind of shut down. Young people are much more open-minded. What we need to do, I don't want to teach young people, because also I have to be humble enough to realize, I don't want to imbue my principles or my thoughts about the world to other people. I want them to at least feel empowered that they can change their own circumstances and that they would not be apathetic. If they're not, I actually even don't care if they move right-wing, move left-wing, move communist, capitalist, religious, non-religious, whatever. But I want the freedom to develop their own minds in ways that are their own personality. Hence, when I mentioned respect for oneself, then respect for the environment, people respect for the environment, starts with respect for oneself. The museum and the botanical garden is essentially to get children to explore, think about nature, a relationship to nature and teamwork and volunteer stuff, and then they can decide what they want to do with it, how they develop it and things. So that's where, and this came to me only 3-4 years ago when I moved away from joining a lot. I used to be arrested almost every month or two. After that, I stopped, joining civil disobedience things, because I think it's more important to create a generation that's thinkers. And I don't know how to describe it. People are so trapped with their own educational backgrounds and religion and society and whatever. And we need to allow them that freedom to go beyond that. And what helped me in life is that I had that opportunity through nature, because through nature, I understand, this animal eats another animal. What about this animal that eats the animal that didn't eat that animal, etc. You start to ask those kinds of questions, and it provides you with the biologic knowledge I think is very helpful to humanity to think about. Max does a lot of this, by the way, in his broadcasts and stuff. I noticed on the YouTubes, this thinking about the connections between biology and social sociology, an area that I'm fascinated by, and hence the museum, I think, is a way that bridges this gap between our basic human biology behind an evolution of our technological evolution of the mass media, the social media, etc. Museum kind of acts as a bridge between those two.
Yeah, it was interesting when you, am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah.
It was interesting when you cut out for a moment earlier. We were talking about, or Max actually asked this wonderful question about whether or not there's a space for multiple narratives within science, not necessarily irreconcilable narratives, but narratives that don't tell the same story within a scientific worldview. And I'm wondering if we could talk more about that, about because to me, I see descriptions of the world, and there can be different descriptions of the world. But I think a lot of science is about quantifying the world, and it seemed to be non-descriptive.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you see your an approach to reconciling multiple
One time
groups.
there was a reporter who asked me, Qumsiyeh, you seem to be confident of your narrative about the situation in Palestine, Israel, Zionism, all this stuff. Have you considered the possibility that maybe you're wrong? Guess how I answered him? I said, of course, as a scientist, that's what we have to do. What is the definition of science, by the way? Definition of science, scientific knowledge, is based now, most scientists will tell you the same thing, which is, Karl Popper actually articulated it very well. He says a scientific hypothesis, one, repeatable, and number two, falsifiable. You know what that means? Repeatable means that somebody else could look at the evidence and the experiments or data or whatever and come up with the same hypotheses, the same thing that you came up with. For example, evolution. Anybody can go look at the evidence, or the earth is round. So anybody can now look at the evidence and come up with the same data and produce the same result. But the second thing, which sometimes people forget, is it has to be falsifiable. What does that mean, falsifiable? Means that somebody can prove it wrong. If there's more data, for example, now that the earth is not spherical, but it's actually oval shaped, an egg shaped, if there's overwhelming new data to that end, scientific hypothesis will go away, and the new scientific hypothesis comes in. So scientific hypotheses are falsifiable. As a scientist, I say the same thing about anything, including Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The evidence is overwhelming about how this history happened and why it happened and the reasons it happened and the logic of its happening and the symptoms of it happening, including the ethnic cleansing, all of this stuff. But it does not mean that it's 100% fact and will remain so forever and ever. Falsifiable also. And I would be more than happy if somebody brings me data to show I am wrong on any of the points that I mentioned, for example, to you in the earlier part of the conversation. If they can prove it to me, then I will retract it and say, and this is actually the best thing that I can do as a scientist, is judge things based on the evidence, the data, not based on emotions or and what I feel. And I changed my views, by the way, on many things historically. Views. I can tell you examples if you want, but that's.
I'm wondering if maybe the other people behind you could scooch a little closer. I'd love to hear about your experiences volunteering, or if Jesse's still there.
Well. Yeah, they're here. Okay. Well, maybe Daniel wants to start, or whoever.
Okay. So yeah, Daniel, I'm from Germany. To be honest, I probably can't tell you too much yet because I just arrived like 5 days ago, and I'm still a little bit overwhelmed by the whole situation. But it's been incredibly enriching so far. I've seen a lot, I've heard a lot, and it's been very interesting. I've learned a lot. Yeah, well, I didn't come here for political reasons, to be honest. So I don't really want to comment on any of the narratives, but I can say that Mazin's argumentation generally is pretty convincing, and I have seen a lot of settlements myself during the last days, and that was really shocking me because they're really building like settlements into Palestinian land, and really looks like they're trying to take over the country in a way. But that was my experience so far. But I really do agree with the mission of the museum, and I think it's great to just get away from being like in the role of a victim and trying to, you know, what Mazin described as empowerment, trying to create something, trying to go somewhere. And I'd like to be a part of that, even if it's just for a short time and with limited needs. And yeah, so I'm really happy to be here, and I still got 3 more weeks, and I will see with what feelings I leave. But I do feel now that it's going to be very enriching and yeah, possibly very valuable experience for me.
Okay. Other people?
Yeah, hi. You may see that I'm a little bit sunburned, so please don't judge me. My name is Matthias. I'm from Austria, and I've been to this region before. I was, so instead of the army, you can do like as a civil service, you can go to an institution that deals with the Holocaust. And I went to Israel. It was like in the north, near the border of Lebanon. And since that, I've always been interested in politics in those regions and things that are happening. So it was like, I also have to see like all, so to say, and people at the museum got me interested into different NGOs, and then yeah, so I came here for political reasons, but not because I'm like very pro this side or pro that side. It's more like I'm just really curious to be here, and since I've been here, I mean, like I arrived on Friday. I mean, Mazin has told you, and I bet you already discussed it. Things have happened at the Temple Mount, and yeah, so it's like this very strange and climate that I've got thrown into it, and I really have to say, like, the experience that I made in Israel at the museum really differ from and Mazin. He's like, he knows so many things, and you can do you can have great conversations with him. So my opinion about better, my view about this whole region got shaped a lot more in the last few days. So yeah, that's kind of my backstory. So.
Hi, so I'm Lysiane. I'm from Canada. I just arrived today at the museum, but I joined a political forum last week, and the evidence I was faced with, the people I heard, things I've seen so far of United States. But I'm looking forward to my 3 weeks here, deepen my knowledge and my experience here, to continue learning and to continue learning and to somehow maybe make a difference.
This is Jessie. I'm Chinese American. Originally, I grew up in Taiwan. I'm also volunteer here. Also join the founded the, and I think because Max has been here, you know, our museum is not a traditional museum. It's more like an institution, and empowered young people. For example, Elias, you know, you watch Elias fresh out of the college, and then develop himself and more confidence, and know that he can do research and do what he likes to learn and get published, and further his futures and careers. And they're and I see those young people, and we are trying to attract more young people like that, and spot any student that has any potential, and that we can provide this environment for them to further develop that's the future generation, and Palestine or any country that needs this kind of environment to groom their young people, because there's limited employment opportunities, and our financial situation is not that solid. We're trying to continue to work hard. Hopefully, we are able to bring in more a higher number of young people fresh out of college to have develop their confidence, thinking, free thinking, and so I think that's what we're trying to do. And our exhibition part is only a small part, and show visitors, students, young kids, as a side goals of the museum. But the main goal of the museum is empowerment, is education, make them realize the environment. Palestine is not a just conflict. It's a place for future with hopes, and hopefully they will be, develop even more attachment to this place and conserve and keep this place beautiful. Continue, hopefully less destruction, less damage.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, so we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. I was wondering if maybe, Mazin, you could return back to the way we started this conversation a couple hours ago and talk a little bit about what's happening in Bethlehem and right now. Max asked me this question while we had the technical interlude about what's happening at the Temple Mount and what is going on in the current state of affairs.
Well, I mean, Jerusalem is an occupied city. Per international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention as Israel applies to it. Can contrary to the international, because they did not recognize Israel even. They don't recognize this annexation. So Jerusalem is occupied territory per international law, for which the Geneva Convention. What that means is that the occupier cannot change anything, cannot build settlements in Jerusalem, cannot build walls, cannot build fences, cannot change the status quo, people coming into their mosque and how they go into the mosque, detectors or not, watched or not being watched, they cannot change anything according to international law. So the Palestinian side has changed a lot, even contrary to international law, including building walls and settlements and so forth. They're coming to change the status quo of the holiest site of Islam in Palestine, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque area, which Israel calls the Temple Mount, but story doesn't matter what they call it. Considered the third holiest site in Islam. Billion people consider it the third holiest site. They don't change anything. They are not allowed to by international law. So that's the problem. And now they are trying because they can get away with it. And this and that point because they're busy with things like has good trust, and the Palestinians in Jerusalem say no. I worry that being when I started, I mentioned my history of uprisings. An uprising in South Africa, which was the last of 15 uprisings in South Africa that finally ended the apartheid system of South Africa.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, well, are there any last comments or questions before we conclude from anybody?
I would like, if you guys want, think about coming to volunteer here. We'd host you. We have a place for you to stay. We feed you. So whatever you like, but come and see things for yourself. And whatever your field is, you can volunteer in area related to your field. Tell you more since he has experienced it. It is not as dangerous as people claim it is. It's probably more dangerous in Manhattan than it is in Bethlehem.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. I was so amazed at Mazin and Jesse's generosity and hospitality. You know, just the environment that they have built is really remarkable. Yeah, and you know that was my hope in having you give this lecture. Is, you know, I think that the museum is a very unique and innovative kind of institution that the world needs more of. So thank you so much for giving your lecture. I regret that it, you know, the bandwidth was so problematic and whatnot, but I think everyone got the gist of things. We'll see when I review the footage how much of it actually went through.
Great, Max, if you could send me the emails of those people, the students, you guys, if you want, I can also send you links to the YouTube video that we have about the museum and about volunteerism. Also, that way you will have my email, so we can exchange emails if you have follow-up questions.
Yeah, I will certainly do that.
Always
I will
investigate yourself. All right.
Yeah, I'll send along relevant infos and things. And on Mazin, could you send me your slideshow so I can send that out? Okay. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So as usual, I'll stop the broadcast and Mazin leave.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
Take care.
So Mazin, if you close the window, I'm gonna check in with my students just about some technical things. So you can X out and then we will continue on. Okay.